Time on our little world is running out. Soon, a great crisis will develop which will test every single person. And then, grace, which has been so mercifully offered to all human beings, will no longer be offered. In Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45, we have been taught that the event that is described in this verse is the event that precedes the close of probation for the entire world. Sadly though, many Seventh-day Adventists have been taught that Daniel 11:40 from verses 40 to 45 has yet to be fulfilled, and that these verses are talking about the papacy, which had its heyday back in the Dark Ages from 538 AD to 1798. Today we shall examine from the scriptures why the papacy is not the power being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 from verses 40 to 45, and give good solid biblical reasons on why this is so. Getting to know the truth regarding Daniel 11 and its ramifications for us all is not hard to understand, because Daniel chapter 11 from verses 40 to 45 shows us exactly where we are in the stream of time. This will enable us to be prepared as we understand what is appearing in the heavenly sanctuary above. In part 1 and part 2 of this video series, we have been clearly taught by the scriptures of truth that Islamic Turkey is the power being spoken of from Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45. To those who are listening, if you haven't watched those first two videos, then we strongly recommend that you do before proceeding any further. From the scriptures, it teaches how Islamic Turkey will soon proceed with a grand event and enter into Jerusalem to establish the long-awaited caliphate. And now, in this video, we shall see how the papacy cannot be the king of the north power being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 from verses 40 to 45, as commonly and erroneously being taught by many modern Seventh-day Adventist preachers of today, contrary to what the pioneers taught of yesteryears. It is a fact that in Daniel chapter 11, the papacy is being spoken of in this prophetic chapter, in verses 31 to 35. These verses tells us the following regarding this sad time in church history called the Dark Ages. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And now verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. This was the beginning of the Reformation movement. Then it continues in verses 33 to 35. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And now verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. As Adventists, we know that the papacy ruled for a time period of 1,260 years, from 538 AD to 1798. when the papacy received a deadly wound when its civil power was removed by General Berthier of France. Talking about this time, the Bible teaches us in Daniel chapter 7 the following about the demise of the papacy, represented here as the little horn power, and it reads, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time, a times, and a dividing of time." Now verse 26, "But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end." So, in 1798, the Bible confirms conclusively that the papacy would lose all its civil authority and power, and would never rise again to dominate the world. However, the Bible still teaches us that the papacy will still have a role to play in the end, but not as it once had. This must be absolutely understood by all. Going back to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40 now, it teaches us something very interesting. "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So we see that the Bible uses the words "at the time of the end." These words are significant because it is telling us that something big was going to take place at 1798, the time of the end, between the king of the south and the king of the north powers, when the papacy received its deadly wound. The little word "at" is used to signify that whatever this big event would be between the king of the south and the king of the north powers, it would happen not before or after 1798, the time of the end. This is significant information to remember. Going back to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40, let's read what big event would take place between the king of the south and the king of the north in 1798. "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So we see that this verse is talking about a war that would break out in 1798, the time of the end, when the papacy received its deadly wound. The word "push" is used, an Old English term to signify war or conflict. In part 1 of this video series, we learned from the scriptures of truth that the location of the king of the south and the king of the north is south and north of Jerusalem in Israel. Therefore, this war would start in 1798, south and north of Jerusalem in Israel, and could not happen before or after 1798, the very year that the papacy received its deadly wound. This is precisely what this verse is teaching us. So, the question that we need to ask then is this: what war would take place in 1798, south and north of Jerusalem? Flicking through the pages of history, let's consult world history to see what great war took place in 1798, south and north of Jerusalem. In the year 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, the king of the south, in order to curb Great Britain's influence in the world. The Battle of the Pyramids, as it has been called by historians, then commenced on the 21st of July 1798. This war was south and north of Israel. France inflicted a massive defeat on the Mameluke army in Egypt. Egypt was a semi-dependent province of the Great Ottoman Empire, the king of the North power. This power was so angered by the French invasion that Turkey declared war on France on September 2nd, 1798. Thus, the king of the North, Turkey, came against him, France, in the same year that the king of the South, Egypt, pushed at Napoleon Bonaparte of France. So, the question that we need to ask to all those who think that the papacy is the king of the North power being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40 is this: what war did the papacy wage south and north of Jerusalem in Israel in 1798? The answer is simple: none. The scriptures of truth declared that at the time of the end, which is 1798, the papal power would come to an end when General Berthier of France took the Pope captive and began consuming his dominion. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40 is God's great prophetic waymark to save his people from deception because of false teachers of prophecy. Another reason why the papacy is not the king of the North power in Daniel chapter 11 from verses 40 to 45 is that the papacy will be destroyed at Christ's second coming. In Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45, talking about this king of the North power, it teaches the following: yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. This verse teaches us that this king of the North power will be destroyed. But when? The next chapter and verse gives us the answer, and it reads, "And at that time shall Michael stand up." So, when Michael stands up, the king of the North power will be destroyed when Michael closes probation for all and starts to execute divine judgments upon the earth, which will be the 7 last plagues. Turkey is this king of the North power and is described symbolically in the book of Revelation. And it reads, "And the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." So, the great river Euphrates actually starts in Turkey and winds itself through other major Islamic nations. The drying up of this river is used symbolically in the book of Revelation to describe the declining power of Turkey from its heyday as an empire until it will finally be destroyed as a nation. All this happens before the 7th plague, which describes the second coming of Christ. Indeed, how fitting to call Turkey a great river. As the river Euphrates begins its life in Turkey, so did the rise and the spread of Islamic teachings begin to grow when the Ottoman Empire began to enlarge into other areas around the world. The drying up of Turkey as a nation is further elaborated upon in Joel chapter 2. Again, talking about this northern army, which is the king of the north power, it states the following: "But I will remove far off from you the northern army, and will drive him into a land barren and desolate, with his face towards the east sea, and his hinder part toward the utmost sea. And his stink shall come up, and his ill saviour shall come up, because he hath done great things." All this is done before the second coming of Christ. The northern army is the king of the north power of Turkey and the other Islamic coalition of nations that will be destroyed before the final end of the world. The scriptures of truth makes it absolutely clear that Turkey, the king of the north power, will be destroyed before the second coming of Christ. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 is clearly talking about Turkey and not the papacy. The papacy will be destroyed at the second coming of Christ and not before, like the king of the north power in verse 45 of Daniel chapter 11. Let's take a look at a few of these verses now that confirms this. Starting in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 2 to 4 and then verse 8. It teaches us the following regarding the destruction of this papal power. "That ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." And now verse 8. "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming." Then again in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 20, it tells us the following regarding the papacy, who was identified as the beast. "And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone." So we see very clearly from the scriptures of truth that this beast system, the papacy, will be destroyed at the second coming of Christ and finally cast into the lake of fire. These truths confirm again that the papacy cannot be the king of the north power that is being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45. Throughout the whole of the scriptures, we do not see anywhere how the papacy is used to signal the close of probation. This will be important as we approach the Sunday law crisis. No one knows how long the Sunday law will last, so having an event like Daniel 11 verse 45 will give us a signal that the world is nearly coming to a close. This will inspire the faith of God's faithful people when they need it the most. As the animals that went into the ark 2 by 2 in the days of Noah, and was a sign to Noah that the flood was about to come, and therefore the end of the world, so Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 will be the signal for God's people who are living during the Sunday law crisis. When they start to see the rumblings of Turkey entering into Jerusalem, this would be a signal to them that the end of all things is at hand. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 and Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 are tied together. As we have learned that the event that takes place in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 is the event that will lead to Michael standing up in chapter 12 and verse 1, and the close of probation for all. With all that's going on in the Middle East right now, it is not difficult to see that Turkey and other Islamic nations uniting for a common cause to retake Jerusalem for its people and establish their long-awaited caliphate. Islamic Turkey is the King of the North power being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45, which will achieve such a feat. For Seventh-day Adventist evangelists and Seventh-day Adventist pastors insisting time and time again that the papacy is the power that is being spoken of in Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45, the Scriptures of Truth has declared all as such to be false teachers. When Turkey finally enters into Jerusalem, the people will finally see that they have been deceived and will turn against all that have propagated such falsehoods. We have been warned. In 1877, Elder James White, the husband of Ellen G. White, wrote something rather interesting regarding the King of the North, which has been used by those that believe that the papacy is the King of the North, and has given them unjust ammunition to stick to their erroneous views. In his letter published in the Review and Herald, dated 1877, Elder James White published his views that the King of the North was Rome or the papacy. He then repeated this same sentiment at the annual General and Michigan Conference session in 1877. This is what he published. Let us take a brief view of the line of prophecy, 4 times spanned in the book of Daniel. It will be admitted that the same ground is passed over in chapters 2, 7, 8, and 11, with this exception that Babylon is left out of chapters 8 and 11. We first pass down the great image of chapter 2, where Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome are represented by the gold, the silver, the brass, and the iron. All agree that these feet are not Turkish but Roman. And as we pass down the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the beast with 10 horns, representing the same as the great image, again all will agree that it is not Turkey that is cast into the burning flame, but the Roman beast. So of chapter 8, all agree that the little horn that stood up against the Prince of Princes is not Turkey, but Rome. In all these 3 lines thus far, Rome is the last form of government mentioned. It is interesting to note that James White completely misses the point that these 2 chapters, Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel 11, make. He fails to see that Rome came about from the western division of Alexander's kingdom and not from the northern. His son Willie White was asked about his father's views on Rome being the King of the North power. One of the individuals who asked about this view from James White was the cunning fox Leroy Froome. Froome sent a letter to Willie White to inquire about his father's view on Daniel 11, and we are given a rather interesting response by Willie White. Please listen carefully to what he had to say. Regardless the views of Elder James White on the King of the North, I can only give a brief outline of a very interesting experience. In order to give anything which approaches to a correct view of this experience, you must take into consideration that Elder White was an Adventist preacher for many years before he was an SDA Adventist, and by study of the literature of the 1844 movement, you will find that prominent writers took the position that Rome was the king of the north, and in this undoubtedly Elder White was to a considerably extent in agreement. During 1877 and 1878, Elder White carried a tremendous burden of soul over the matter of securing payment of the pledges and clearing the college debt, and he came up to the General Conference of 1878, held in the Battle Creek Fairgrounds in a big pavilion, standing very near where Dr. Kellogg's mansion now stands, with determination to do everything in his power to help our brethren to get broader views and to make greater sacrifices. During the earlier part of this year, or possibly the last of 1877, there appeared in the Review an article by Elder Smith under the title "Without Excuse." This you will read with deep interest because it intimates that the existing war between Russia and Turkey was probably the beginning of Armageddon. Elder Smith, in one of his earliest discourses, presented in a very thrilling way the same thoughts as were in the editorial. To Elder White, this was a great shock because if the logic of Elder Smith's discourse was taken seriously, the people would naturally conclude that Elder White's burden was too late in the day and entirely out of place. The natural result of the full acceptance of Elder Smith's article and sermon would be for our brethren to say that the end is at hand. Take an armful of tracts, go out and distribute them, and then watch for the Son of Man in heaven. The acceptance of this view would undermine all the plans and all the efforts that Elder White was making to clear the debt from our institutions and to get out people to adopt broader views and make stronger efforts for the promulgation of the truth. In response to this, Elder White walked into the pulpit and presented the old view regarding the King of the North. During the few months preceding this meeting, I had read Daniel and Revelation by Elder Uriah Smith. I loved the writer, I admired his style, I loved his teaching, and I was shocked when Elder White presented another view regarding the King of the North. One day I said to him, "Father, I have just read Elder Smith's book and his exposition seems clear to me. Do you really believe that Rome is the King of the North?" His answer was, "I think Elder Smith is going too fast in his exposition, and I thought it was time to present something to check the current of belief that what is transpiring was the beginning of Armageddon." Then, in 1919, by a request, Willie White wrote a similar letter to Elder Jean Villemot at the Ontario Conference. In it, he stated the following: "Please listen carefully." Early in the meeting, Elder Uriah Smith presented the great congregation the same thoughts that he had been presenting in the review, that the Turco-Russian War of 1877 to 1878 was the beginning of Armageddon. In Father's efforts to arouse our brethren to clear off the BC college debt and to raise money for the BC Sanitarium and for the European mission and the proposed British mission and other things, he had met the plea, "It is too late, Elder White, to plan for all these things. Too late, too late." And when he heard Elder Smith's presentation, fear seized his soul, and he threw in his exposition of Daniel 11. Not so much that he really believed it, as that he thought it would check a movement that he thought was bordering onto fanaticism and might lead to the hindrance of the work to be done. These two letters from James White's son, Willie White, speak for themselves. James White only stated that the King of the North was Rome to help stem the belief that the world was nearly coming to a close, so that he could help to get the Seventh-day Adventist Church more money to pay off some debts that the SDA Church owned. The fact that Leroy Froome knew of this is absolutely astonishing and shows how much he wanted to conceal everything within the church to suit his own narrative. It was during his time that our church began teaching that the papacy is the King of the North. You can clearly see how Satan used Leroy Froome and Louis Weir, a man that had considerable impact on prophetic interpretations on the church, changed the truth regarding who the King of the North power really was. Yet, the light of God's truth continues to shine to those that are willing to study it. These two letters, alongside everything the church has published for decades regarding the truth about Turkey as the King of the North power, clearly outlines the unity that the church had during that time. Daniel 11 is a chronological discourse of the nations and their acts that lead up to the close of probation. Many people assume that the pioneers changed their views regarding who the King of the North really was during Ellen G. White times. This assumption is incorrect. Historical Advent sources reveals very carefully that the Adventist Church during the times of Ellen G. White believed universally that the King of the North power in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 was Turkey. This can be shown in the 1904 Sabbath School Quarterly and the Bible readings for the Home School, a book which practically every Seventh-day Adventist owned. Even after the death of Ellen G. White, the King of the North power identified in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45 was still being taught as Turkey, as shown in the Signs of the Times magazine in 1916. This edition dedicated virtually the whole magazine to that power, Turkey, and its place in prophecy. This truth was taught at least up until the 1950s, when great changes had already begun to affect the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Today, and sadly, this truth is not being upheld in the modern Seventh-day Adventist churches around the world. Something has gone terribly wrong. This truth is very important to know, because Daniel chapter 11 shows us exactly where we are in the stream of time, and when Christ will step out from the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary. If prophecy teachers are putting Daniel chapter 11 verse 40 to 45 into the future, then they shall all be in for a rude awakening when probation closes and their characters are unprepared. The book of Daniel is a book that chronicles the nations and their acts leading up to the close of probation.
And so let's look there in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 41 and see what is taking place here as we continue with this prophecy. So Daniel chapter 11 verse 41, and he shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. The reason why it's exciting is because even though it seems a little fearful to be moving into the future like this and these uncertain times, we're in verse 41 right now. This is where we are. We're actually studying where we are right now. What we're going to be studying right now is what's happening in our world right now. We're in verse 41 and verse 42.
Versus the kingdom of the south. Now, again, In ancient times, God's people were caught in the crossfire between the king of the north and the king of the south. At the end of the world, God's people are again caught in a philosophical crossfire between apostate Christianity. So that's going to be how history repeats. So when I look at the part of Daniel 11 that is yet to be fulfilled, what I would expect would be to see that the papacy's deadly wound will heal. It will come back, a military power will sustain it and support it, which will then lead to the union of church and state, which will lead to the persecution of the saints. But then the papacy will come to its final end as Jesus comes back. When the final events kick in, it's going to go fast. And Daniel 11, 40 to 45 is chronicling those final events.
If these popular prophecy teachers are teaching that the king of the north power in Daniel chapter 11 from verses 40 to 45 is Rome and not Turkey, and that the prophecy in Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45 is still yet to be fulfilled, when in actual fact verses 40 to 44 have been fulfilled, then these teachers will be leading multitudes into a great deception, which will only become apparent when the close of probation has finally happened. These people and their followers will then find themselves without a shelter under God's protection in the time of trouble, because they thought that they had time to perfect their characters. Can you see why prophetic truth is so important? Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40 to 44 has been fulfilled and is not future. Verse 45 is the only verse left that has yet to be fulfilled. And this happens when Turkey sets up its caliphate in Jerusalem. The close of probation is a lot closer than what many people believe. Christ, our mediator and our great high priest, is soon to leave the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. The events that we see happening in the Middle East should make us aware that greater events are soon to transpire. This should make us sure that our characters today are perfect in Christ. The knowledge regarding the close of probation is far more important than even the second coming of Christ, because at that time Christ is only coming back to reward his saints and to destroy the ungodly. If we misunderstand Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45, we are sure that we shall be too late to perfect our characters when the close of probation finally happens. We have been warned. Throughout the entire Bible, there is not one text which shows us that the papacy gives us a signal that human probation is about to close. Only one event shows us this, and it's in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 45. God in his great mercy has put this in his word so that none will be lost. How we treat Daniel 11 and the sanctuary message may determine our entire salvation. Again, we have been warned. Ellen G. White, concerned about knowing the correct events that lead up to the close of probation, penned the following. The events connected with the close of probation and the work of preparation for the time of trouble are clearly presented, but multitudes have no more understanding of these important truths than if they had never been revealed. Let us all have the correct prophetic understanding of Daniel chapter 11 as taught by God to the Adventist pioneers.